Welcome, everyone. It's tough to talk about, but important. We're going to be talking about the Botham Jean incident.
It's a case that really brings up a lot of issues about justice, accountability, and the whole relationship between law enforcement and the communities that they're supposed to serve.
Yeah, and, Botham Jean, a lot of people will remember him. He was a really promising young man. He was only 26, an accountant from St. Lucia, really involved in his church, doing great at PwC, and from what everybody says, just a really great guy.
And his life was cut short way too early, back in September of 2018 when he was shot in his own apartment in Dallas. And the person who shot him was an off-duty police officer, Amber Geiger.
It's a case that leaves you with so many emotions. Sadness, anger, confusion. It's important to remember as we go through this that a real person lost his life, all family was shattered, and a community is still trying to understand what happened.
We're going to try to piece together what happened that night and look at what happened afterward with the legal system. And we're going to talk about how this case changed the national conversation about police reform.
Right, and we'll also look at the Botham Jean Act, a law in Texas that's trying to prevent similar tragedies from happening again.
And, we want to make it clear right from the start, police officers, they have a really hard job. It's dangerous. We support them in what they do, keeping us safe. But when something goes wrong, especially when someone dies, there has to be accountability and a real effort to change things.
Yeah, absolutely. And what happened in this case, the details of the shooting, they're really disturbing. Let's go back to that night in September 2018 and see if we can figure out what we know about what happened.
Well, according to the lawsuit from Jean's family, Amber Geiger had just finished working, a long shift, and she was going back to her apartment, at least she thought it was her apartment, the Southside Flats complex.
But she didn't go to her own apartment. She ended up at Botham Jean's door, one floor above hers. And there's been a lot of talk about how she could have made that mistake. The lawsuit says that the apartment complex, they had a lot of problems with their doors. They wouldn't close right. Maybe some were even left unlocked. And that could have confused Geiger.
And it makes you wonder, even if you're tired after a long shift, how could a trained police officer not realize they were going into the wrong apartment? The lawsuit says there were things inside Jean's apartment that should have made it clear it wasn't her place.
It's hard to understand how that could happen. And the lawsuit says that even the parking garage at the complex was confusing, that the signs weren't clear enough, and people might end up on the wrong floor because of that.
When you think about those things together, the problems with the doors and then the parking garage, it seems like it would be easy to make a mistake there. And in this case, that mistake was terrible.
Yeah, inside his apartment, Botham Jean was just relaxing, on his couch. He was eating ice cream, watching TV. He didn't have a weapon. He wasn't a threat to anyone.
But then everything changed. Geiger? She thought she was going into her own apartment that someone had broken in, and she shot her gun twice, hit Jean right in the chest.
The lawsuit describes that moment, and it's awful. This young man, he's at home, and suddenly he's facing this scary situation, and then he's killed.
It was just chaos after that. Geiger called 911. Paramedics got Jean to the hospital, but it was too late. He died from the gunshot wounds.
I can't even imagine what his family went through then. They're still going through it.
The Dallas Police Department, their initial response, it caused a lot of anger and protests. People felt like Geiger wasn't being held accountable for what she did.
At first, they charged her with manslaughter. And a lot of people thought that wasn't enough, given what happened. They said it was racial bias because Jean was black and Geiger was white.
And the Say Their Names exhibit at Stanford, we've included that in the materials for this deep dive. It's a really powerful reminder of how many black people have been killed in situations like this with law enforcement.
It makes you realize this wasn't just a one-time thing. It's part of a bigger problem, something we need to pay attention to and do something about. In the end, Geiger was fired from the police, and then a grand jury indicted her, but this time on a murder charge.
The trial, it was emotional. The prosecution, they said Geiger acted recklessly and that there were signs that she was in the wrong apartment, signs she ignored.
But her defense team, they said she really believed she was in her own place and that she was scared for her life.
The jury decided she was guilty of murder. That was a big decision, especially in a city like Dallas where there's been tension between the police and communities of color.
And then came the sentencing. Botham Jean's mother, Allison Jean, she spoke, and it was heartbreaking. She talked about her son, what kind of person he was, his dreams, and how much it hurt to lose him in such a senseless way.
And then Botham Jean's younger brother, Brant, he talked directly to Geiger. He said he forgave her and he even hugged her. It was an incredible moment, something that went beyond just what was happening in the courtroom.
Yeah, it was really something. The jury gave Geiger a 10-year prison sentence, and people had different reactions to that. Some thought it was fair, others said it wasn't enough for taking a young man's life.
But the legal stuff didn't end there. The Jean family, they also sued Geiger and the apartment complex for wrongful death. They said the complex was negligent, that the lack of security led to Botham Jean's death.
That shows how accountability, it's not just about the person who pulled the trigger. Sometimes the way things are set up, the negligence, that can create a situation where something terrible is more likely to happen.
And that lawsuit, it was so detailed. It went deep into all the problems with security at the Southside Flats complex.
It must have been so painful for the Jean family to go through all that, having to talk about what happened over and over again in court. But they went ahead with it. And that shows how much they wanted to hold everyone accountable, not just Amber Geiger.
Right. The lawsuit, it lays it all out there, all the things they say went wrong, the mistakes that could have been prevented and that they believe led to Botham Jean's death.
And they're not just blaming people. They're asking bigger questions about responsibility, about what property owners and managers have to do to keep the people who live there safe.
A big part of the lawsuit, it was about those faulty doors. They say residents complained a lot that the doors wouldn't latch right. Some were even left unlocked.
Can you imagine living there, knowing that your door might not lock properly? It's scary.
The lawsuit, it gives examples, people who had problems with the doors. So it wasn't just a one-time thing. It seems like it was happening a lot. And the management, they didn't do enough about it.
And to think that something like a door not working right could end up causing someone to die.
It makes you think about how important it is to say something. If you see a problem, if you see something dangerous, it could be in your building or anywhere, we all have a responsibility to speak up.
Right, and the lawsuit talks about the parking garage, too. They say the design was bad, that it was confusing, especially on the floors where the apartment entrances were.
Remember, Amber Geiger, she said she went to the wrong apartment, thought it was hers, even though it was on a different floor. And the lawsuit, it says the signs weren't good and the different floors in the garage looked too similar, so it's understandable how someone could get mixed up.
It's frightening, really. Even a small mistake in the design, it can have terrible consequences. Architects, builders, people who manage buildings, they need to think about safety and make sure things are clear and easy to understand.
The lawsuit doesn't just focus on the physical stuff, the doors, the garage. They also talk about security in general at the complex.
Like, were there security cameras in the hallways? Was there enough light? Things like that could make a difference in preventing something like this from happening.
Yeah, and they say in the lawsuit that the security just wasn't good enough, that the management knew about it but didn't really fix the problems.
It makes you realize that safety, it's not just about having locks and cameras. It's about people being careful, paying attention, feeling like they can speak up if they see something that's not right.
Well, this wrongful death lawsuit, it went on for a long time. But then in November of this year, a federal jury in Dallas, they made a decision. They said Amber Geiger has to pay almost $100 million to the Jean family.
That's a huge amount of money. It seems like the jury, they believe the apartment complex, they were partly responsible for Botham Jean's death.
But there's something you have to remember. With a judgment like that, getting that much money, it can be really hard. Especially in a case like this, because Amber Geiger, she probably doesn't have that kind of money.
Right. There's a legal term for that, isn't there? Being judgment-proof.
Right. Exactly. It means that someone or a company, they just don't have the money to pay what they owe. The debt is still there, but it's hard to actually collect the money.
So even though the jury awarded all that money to the Jean family, there's no guarantee they'll actually see it.
That's how it is sometimes. It's complicated. There are ways to try to collect the money, even from someone who's judgment-proof.
It's just not fair, The family, they win in court, but then they might still have to fight to get what they're owed.
It shows how the legal system, it tries to do what's right, but it doesn't always work perfectly. People who've been hurt, their families, they need support even after the case is over.
So we've been talking about the lawsuit, but the Botham Jean case, it also changed the law in Texas.
You mean the Botham Jean Act. It was passed because people were so angry about what happened and because they wanted real change.
And that law, it's about police body cameras, right? Can you tell us more about how it works and what kind of impact it's had?
Yeah, so the Botham Jean Act, it became law back in 2021, and it says that police officers in Texas, they have to keep their body cameras on the whole time they're involved in an investigation. And that's not just when they're responding to a call, but anytime they're interacting with someone as part of an investigation.
So it's not just about recording arrests or traffic stops. It's about everything they do, like talking to witnesses or collecting evidence.
That's right. They want a full recording of what the police are doing, not just little pieces here and there.
It seems like that's directly related to what happened with Botham Jean, because there were different stories about what happened inside his apartment. If there had been body camera footage, it would have been clear what really happened.
Absolutely. The Botham Jean Act, it's about making things more transparent, so everyone can see what's going on. And it's about accountability for the police and for the people they're supposed to protect. It's about building trust and making sure there's a record everyone can trust if there are questions later on.
And the law says how the footage has to be handled, right?
Yeah.
I think I read something about a chain of custody.
Yeah, you're right. The Botham Jean Act, it has rules about how the body camera footage is collected, how it's stored, who can access it. They want to make sure the footage is handled correctly and that nobody can mess with it or change it.
That's a big step towards making law enforcement more transparent. But are there any problems with the act? Has it been successful?
Well, when you have a new law, especially one that involves technology and changing how police departments do things, there are always going to be challenges.
What are some of the challenges they've seen since the act went into effect?
One of the biggest things is making sure everyone's following the law. Some police departments, they haven't been able to give their officers the right equipment, the body cameras, or the training they need to use them the right way.
And if the officers aren't recording like they're supposed to, then the law won't work.
Another problem is just dealing with all the data. Body cameras, they record a lot of video, and police departments, they have to figure out how to store all that and how to make sure people can access it if they need to.
And you have to think about privacy, too. Body cameras, they record everything, including things that are private, so there need to be rules about who can see that footage and how it's protected.
That's an important point. The Botham Jean Act, it tries to address those concerns, but there's still a lot of discussion about how to balance transparency and accountability with people's right to privacy.
It sounds like the Botham Jean Act. It's a good start, but there's still work to be done.
But the fact that this law exists, that it's named after Botham Jean, that's a good thing. It shows how, even from something tragic, positive change can happen.
There's one more thing about the investigation that I want to talk about because it caused a lot of controversy back then. It's about the search warrant for Botham Jean's apartment after the shooting.
You mean the marijuana they found in his apartment?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It made a lot of people angry. Can you remind us what happened and why people were so upset about it?
So after Botham Jean was shot, the Dallas police, they got a search warrant for his apartment. That's normal in a situation like that. But on the list of things they said they found in the apartment, they included a small amount of marijuana.
And people were furious about that because they saw it as a way to make Botham Jean look bad, even though he was the victim.
A lot of people said it was irrelevant, that the amount of marijuana was small, and in a lot of states it wouldn't even be illegal. They thought the police were trying to distract people from what the officer did by making Jean look bad.
It does make you wonder if they were trying to shift the blame, even though he's the one who was killed.
It also brings up the whole issue of implicit bias, how even little things can be used to make someone look bad, especially if they're from a group that's often discriminated against.
That whole thing with the marijuana, it became a symbol of how unfair the system was in this case.
It reminds us to be careful about how information is presented, how it can be used to influence what people think, especially when it comes to cases involving the police and people of color.
We have to remember, Botham Jean, he was the victim. He was in his own home where he should have been safe.
His death was a tragedy, and we need to honor him by continuing to fight for justice and accountability, not just in this case, but every time a police officer's actions result in someone dying.
This case, the Botham Jean case, it really changed the national conversation about police reform. It made it clear that these aren't just theoretical issues. They're real things that happen, and they have devastating consequences for people, families, entire communities.
We've made some progress, but there's still so much to do to make the system fair and just for everyone.
We've talked about a lot today, and it's clear that this case, it's complicated. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to focus on Botham Jean himself.
It's easy to get caught up in all the legal details and the debates about police reform, but we can't forget that this was a real person whose life was taken. His story shows us how important it is to stay involved, to keep fighting for what's right. We can't just let these things happen. We have to create a world where everyone feels safe and valued.
Well, thank you for listening to this deep dive. It's a tough subject, but it's important to talk about these things. I hope this conversation has made you think, learn something new, maybe even inspired you to do something.
If you want to know more about the sources we used for this episode, just let us know. We're happy to share them.
And like always, we would appreciate it if you liked this episode, left a comment, shared it with people you know.
And subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. We'll be back next week with a new topic, digging into another important issue.
Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and don't give up hope. We can make a difference if we work together.